Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Monica Wedlock Kilpatrick, and I serve as the Director of Organizational Development for the National Benevolent Association of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. As we get started, I would like to inform you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for future viewing on the NBA website at nbacares.org/mental-health. This webinar continues our 2019 series of webinars and educational trainings offered by the Mental Health and Wellness Initiative. Today's topic is After Suicide, how communities of faith can help reduce suicide contagion and support healing after a suicide loss. With hopes to build awareness and offer a tool for meaningful discourse during 2019's National Suicide Awareness Week, coming this September 8th through 14th, we are hosting this dialogue between Reverend Angela Whitenhill Shields and MBA's Mental Health and Wellness Initiative Manager, and our special guest, the Reverend Dr. Rachael Keefe, author of the Lifesaving Church, Faith Communities and Suicide Prevention. During this webinar, our speakers will highlight what congregations and communities of faith can do after suicide loss. Particular attention will be paid to safe messaging and healthy theological perspectives about suicide. And we will offer tips on effective leadership and pastoral care, ways to minimize contagion risk, and wisdom about how to create a safe and loving space for grieving the loss of a loved one after suicide. This webinar can be used as a tool for discussion and practical tips in congregations, communities, in your region, and in the general church. At the end of this presentation, there will be time for questions. And throughout the webinar, if you have questions that emerge, we welcome you to use the Q&A feature by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions. Please include your email address so that if we are unable to get to your question, we can follow up with you directly after the webinar is over. To request technical assistance, you may also use the Q&A feature. If you are participating by phone, you may email me at mkilpatrick@nbacares.org. Again, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available for future viewing on the NBA website in the coming weeks. To begin, let me introduce our speakers. Reverend Dr. Rachael Keefe, again, is the author of the Lifesaving Church, Faith and Community Suicide and Suicide Prevention, and pastor of Living Table United Church of Christ in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She's a favorite conference presenter on topics related to the church and mental health, particularly suicide and congregations. Previously, she served as a clinical chaplain at a state psychiatric hospital where she worked with patients, staff, clergy, and faith communities to increase understanding and welcome of persons living with severe and persistent symptoms of mental illness. She also served on a state suicide prevention council. Since her ordination in 1992, Keefe has served in many different ministry capacities. She graduated with degrees from Princeton Theological Seminary and Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School. She's a painter and poet, and her other published works are 3 in a series of theological poetry, which you can find out more about by visiting her website, beachtheology.com. Welcome, Rachael.
Thank you.
And Reverend Angela Whitenhill Shields serves as the MBA Mental Health and Wellness Initiative Manager. She's an innovative family and children therapist, as well as a licensed minister with experience in the mental health field and higher education, with proven success in interdisciplinary program development, bridge building, and organizational leadership. As a licensed clinical social worker, Angela specialized in trauma, suicide, depression, identity issues, and spirituality integrated psychotherapy. She formerly served as a chaplain and therapist at the Tennyson Center for Children, an MBA Health and Social Service Ministry partner, and one of the Rocky Mountain region's leading residential treatment centers, where she helped create one of the nation's few spiritually integrated residential treatment programs. She has led and facilitated multiple training workshops on therapeutic intervention and cultural competence within the social work field. Angela earned her Master of Social Work degree from the University of Denver and a Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary in New York City. She also earned her certificate in marriage and family therapy from the Denver Family Institute, where she served as a psychotherapist at the Institute's Community Clinic. At this time, I'll turn the presentation over to Angela and Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica. And we're just grateful that you all would join us. This is a topic that is not easy to talk through, but so necessary. And with September coming up as a awareness month for us, and particularly September 8th through 14th being a prevention week, we really wanted to have some sort of resource for us as people in the church to have to mull over for a month and even show during that month. And so we want to acknowledge that a lot of us come to this topic with personal connection. And that is welcome here. So we ask that you bring that to your questions. And some of us here are coming because we want to be more sensitive in our congregation or just be better leaders. So we're hoping that our conversation today meets those needs. We're going to have an informal conversation with questions. I am so excited to be with my colleague, Reverend Dr. Keefe. I've heard her speak, and she's influenced my own way of thinking about this topic, despite me being trained, despite me having my own experience. So I'm definitely excited to hear more thoughts today. So we'll start off with our first question, which is really just those of us who work in an organization or a church know that within our congregations and within our organizations, we can be very good at talking about suicide prevention often, but sometimes we'll fall silent after a suicide or after suicidal behavior actually happens within our community for all kinds of reasons. And so to start with just our first question, I did want to think through why having conversations about the aftermath of suicide or suicidal behavior is just important for us to have in general. This, what we call postvention work, which you can explain, but why is that important for us to have?
It's essential because there's so much shame and stigma around suicide, particularly in the church. And if we don't begin to have those conversations, that shame and stigma continues. And those two things are primary contributors to more suicidal behavior or more suicide deaths. In postvention, which is how in the clinical world we talk about what happens after a suicide death has occurred, we talk about minimizing contagion. And suicide isn't contagious the way that colds are contagious. But if you are someone who is vulnerable, if you are struggling with suicidal thoughts and someone dies by suicide, that increases your risk. And the closer you are to that person, the greater your own risk becomes. So those weeks and months after the loss of someone to suicide, others are much more vulnerable. And if we don't talk about it, if we don't bring a voice of hope, a voice of healing into that conversation, we let the shame settle in, and that can be lethal.
Definitely. I thank you for that. I think what strikes me a lot is about the idea of being vulnerable after, and those of us who are tied to a loved one being more vulnerable. And I find that is not a bad thing. That doesn't mean we're weak, right? That means we're human and we're deeply connected to the people we lost. And so I appreciate you naming that. It's something that's very normal that we face loss, no matter how tough we are in that way.
Yeah.
With that said, I wanted to start off by just, if you could describe your book. I've read, I have a copy, but I think it'd be a great way to start this conversation, describing what it is and how leaders and clergy, congregational leaders can actually use the tool in the midst of suicide.
The book is mostly using my own story. I was suicidal as an adolescent, and how the church I grew up in came to save my life. Excuse me. They rallied around me. They let me know that my life was valued without passing judgment. There was no theological statements. None of that happened. So I used them as the basis for what a church could be, and how much more if we did it intentionally. Because I realized that congregation didn't do it intentionally. They did it because I was a child of that church and they cared about me. But when I was writing the book, I was like, how can we create intentional life-saving communities? So I used my story, and then each chapter has some of my story and then some theological reflection and some clinical reflection. in a very practical what you can do now section at the end of each chapter. And that makes it accessible, it makes it practical and useful. And then in the back, there are several appendices for very helpful things, what you can say or not say when conducting a memorial service. Prayers that you can say with people who are struggling with suicide loss. There's even a section where you can write in, excuse me, all of your local resources. So the book it tells my story, which I tried to do it in a way that is relatable, but there's also some theological guidance, some clinical guidance, and some real practical steps that my colleagues and some lay people who've read it have said that it has changed the way they approach folks who are struggling with suicidality or families who have lost a loved one to suicide.
I can attest to this. I get calls all the time, just in the job that I am, and mostly around eulogies. And what do you say? How does a pastor be?
Right.
And I will pick it up and go to the appendix. And that it's just something to name for those of us who are community leaders or clergy who think deeply about this. When it happens to you, you still need support. You still need resources. It's different if you have an emotional attachment. And so I do really appreciate the book being that for me in moments that I get called on. But really, one of the things I want to lift up is just the nuance of identities and the multiple factors that play into your own story. I'll talk a little about that later, but from the psychological world, we're so made up. There's so many things that happen to us over our time that lead us to these places. And I just thought it was really good bringing those in. It's not a one, reasoned feeling that we have. And so.
Right. And I think that's important to say, is that there's never one cause for suicide or suicidal behavior. There are multiple factors for everyone. There's never one thing. It may be the one last thing put someone over the edge and they engaged in suicidal behavior, but there's no one causal factor. And I think that's important to stress, because when we lose someone to suicide, we feel responsible, we feel guilty, like I should have known, I should have done something. And sometimes we just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Which leads me to the next question I think is so important for us, because it's, like I said, when it happens in our community, we just don't know what to do. We don't know what to say. And so I would love for you to talk through the messaging that is important for us and why we would message suicide this way. How does it look different after versus maybe before?
Well, it looks different after because we want to sort of walk the line that offers hope without making a clear, definitive theological statement. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. But really, when we're talking about messaging, we want to use what we call safe messaging, which is when we take out any implied value judgment from our language. So you will notice that I say that someone engaged in suicidal behavior rather than saying someone attempted suicide or had a failed suicide attempt or a successful suicide. When you put those qualifiers in for the person who is struggling, it almost can be a challenge. I remember after I had engaged in suicidal behavior and somebody referred to it as a failure, my first thought was, well, the next time I'll show you, I won't fail. So we tried to take out any of that language. So we talk about the behavior, or if someone dies by suicide, that's what they do. It's died by suicide, not a completed suicide or successful suicide. So that's really important. And I know that, just talking about it casually in this setting, it doesn't seem to matter, but it really does. And the other thing that is probably the most critical is when someone in our community or in our family dies by suicide, we do not talk about the means by which they died. If you need to process that, then do so with a mental health professional. But try not to talk about it with your family and friends, because the truth is we never know who's at risk. And when you are talking about the means by which someone died by suicide, you are confirming for someone who is struggling with suicidal thoughts that is a sure way to die. And we don't want to do that. And there's also a vicarious trauma. You share that trauma with someone else unnecessarily. So if you see media outlets reporting the means by which someone died by suicide, please write to them, call them, do whatever you can to get them to stop doing that. We know now that the months after the Netflix show 13 Reasons Why came out, there was a significant increase in adolescent suicide. And they have since not pulled the show, but they have at least removed the very graphic suicide scene from the show. We also know there was a significant increase in suicides after the death of the two celebrities last summer, because the means by which they died were talked about in the media. So that's one of the most essential things that we can do, is to not disclose that, and to not minimize the person who died by suicide as being only about suicide. To talk about them in the fullness of their life, their struggles, their joys, all that made them who they were.
I appreciate you saying that, because I think even on the side of being clergy or therapy, or therapists, you want people to feel free to express how they're feeling, particularly if you have a corporate setting.
Right.
And I find myself always that line between feel free to express your emotion, but there's something that comes up that I'd love to hear what you think. And this, I don't know the right term for it, but there's almost I want to call it hysteria, or a feeling of, it's really impacting me, and the only way that I can communicate that is to make my experience of what I heard really, really intense, so that the person receiving it can feel how much it's hitting me. And in that intensity, I use the language around how and whatnot, and I kind of, what we call looping, I keep mulling it over. So it's out of my own reaction of trying to process.
Right.
But how do we acknowledge that feeling, and then also direct us to talk through it in a way that is safe for those of us hearing what we're talking through?
First of all, suicide loss is dramatic. It is huge. It is overwhelming. And the closer you are to the person, the more dramatic, the more traumatic, the more overwhelming it is. So to have that loop of thought that goes around and around in your head, it is expected. It's almost odd if it doesn't happen at some point in the days, weeks, months following the suicide. But to process that, process it one-on-one with a therapist. Try not to process that kind of thing in a group, because we never know who's at risk. There are suicide loss survivors groups that are very helpful. I encourage people to go to those, 6 months to a year after the event, but not in those first few days, weeks, months, where it's so raw and so overwhelming is the only word that I can use for it. Because all we want to do in those moments is for people to see how much pain we're in, this gaping hole that is in our lives. And that's not helpful to share in a group. So find a mental health care professional or a well-trained pastor to talk with about that. Those conversations, particularly if you need to talk about how the person died, what they did, and how you feel because they did it in that particular way, then those conversations are best had one-on-one.
I appreciate you naming that. I know when I walked with people after, individual felt safer, but also tools like writing, singing, different things that we could do in intimate spaces. And or if you are in a group, it was always a group that was intentionally set up for that. So I would be trained to host that, it was a corporate moment that we lost somebody, so we talked through it. And so, thank you for that.
Yeah, that's an important question. And groups are good. They're helpful and healthy to process if there's clear structure and boundaries, and everyone agrees that they can talk about this, and no one will be at increased risk that they know of in that moment.
One thing I just want to bring up to this too, I know those of us who are maybe a little bit on the outside of the loss, so we are at the church, but it's not our family, or we are working organization and it's somebody, at a different organization. It's really easy for us to get, I would say, heady or start pontificating the theory behind, or just talk about it in a way that's not sensitive. And I would encourage us all to be really careful with how we're flippant, not intentionally, because it is, I like to tell people, you have to treat it like a grief and loss moment, not just a suicide, but that there is a loss involved, versus us thinking about, suicide theoretically or
Right.
Politically and things like that. And so I don't know if you had thoughts.
Well, we do that to keep the pain at a distance, to keep the threat of it becoming real in our own lives or closer in our own lives. We intellectualize to keep things distant. We can tell ourselves we're trying to understand and we're trying to offer comfort, but really it's to keep that distance. But when talking with someone who has experienced suicide loss, as a therapist and as a pastor, I have witnessed no deeper pain than a parent who loses a child to suicide. I've also seen nothing greater when it's someone who loses a spouse to suicide, the guilt, the how come I didn't know, or I should have, I could have, I would have. So to recognize that if we are a few people removed, as a member of our community, but not a member of our family, the loss is somehow scary because, how could someone we know die by suicide? But it's also something that we need to let ourselves feel. We're not very good with grief in this country. So if you catch yourself intellectualizing it or, sort of being dismissive about it, ask yourself why that is. Where is it touching me that I don't want it to? To make it personal, not in a way that diminishes the people who are closest to the loss, but in a way that connects you to their pain, that's real and honest.
Is so important. And I think what I'll do is I'm going to jump to one other around, we're kind of moving into this, but
yep.
Spend some time, we'd love to spend some time with what do family and friends need. And need can be psychologically,
right.
spiritually, tangibly, but what are all the needs that come up?
There are so many, and yet everyone processes death and trauma and suicide differently. I mean, I've heard stories from suicide loss survivors that said, in the few weeks after, the most helpful thing someone did was bring paper towels and toilet paper. Because we're all like, we'll bring casseroles or we'll bring cookies or we'll do all of the things that we do when someone is grieving. But the practical things, you have so many extra people through your house that your paper products are gone and you don't have it together to go to the store to get more, and I've also heard similar things about, getting diapers for the baby, the very practical kinds of things that we overlook because we want to make that gesture of healing, of I see you. And sometimes we do the very wrong things or the redundant things. The best way to know what folks need after a suicide of a loved one is to say, don't just say, what can I do? Or call me if you need me, because that's overwhelming. But say, I can drive your kids to school. I can get you some groceries. Which of these things would you like me to do? So identify things that you are able to do. Practical, I can come sit with you for a couple hours. I can, whatever is in your ability to do, offer those things and let the person say yes or no to what they actually might need. That's probably the best thing you can do, is identify what you're able to provide within reason and just say, hey, I know you're overwhelmed and this is horrible, but I would like to offer these things. Are any of them or all of them useful to you?
So important. I hear so many people when they say, what do you need? I don't know.
Right.
And there's an anger, like, I don't know. And that is so normal. So I thank you for a practical way of listening. I wanted to add, just on maybe an emotional level, and this again, it's going to be different for everybody, but I cannot stress that any and all emotions, which you'll have so many different varied, are normal and okay.
Yep.
Go ahead.
And they don't go away. We have a tendency in this country to think that grief only should last a certain period of time. Our workplaces give us, 5 days, 10 days leave. But there is no time limit on grief in general. And there's certainly zero time limit on suicide loss. So, one of the things you don't say is, get over it. It's been a year. Why aren't you over it? I know that sounds like I shouldn't have to say that, but when we become uncomfortable, we become defensive, and then we kind of blame the other person for still being stuck in grief when we think they should be over it. It's almost impossible to, quote unquote, get over it. We can accommodate that grief. We can accommodate that loss. And sometimes even after we've accommodated it fairly well, it just comes up out of nowhere and overwhelms us again. So just make room for all kinds of feelings, yours and the people that you are trying to walk with as they go through this grief.
Those of us clergy or people sitting with a friend who's walking through it or a family member, I have had the most raw feelings, and it's very easy for me to want to solve or change. Some of the, I want to name some of the feelings.
Okay.
Anger is huge with some of my personal friends. Anger that the person left them, anger that they didn't tell them, anger at themselves. And so that is normal and okay in a stage, and a beautiful stage to walk through with somebody, allow anger to be. One that I find people feel shamed about or can be caught off guard is relief at times, depending on the context. And just being able to hold that and walk with people through that stage.
Right.
Deep anguish, but those ones, anger and relief and embarrassment, are ones that are really hard for us to hold as people who are supporting.
Right. Well, because shame plays a huge part of that. How could you do this to me, to your family? How, and it's, there's an old saying that suicide is selfish, and that's just not correct. I can tell you from having been there that what I refer to as the voices of depression lie. They convince you that your life has no value. No one would miss you if you were gone. Your family would be better off without you. So in a weird sort of backwards way, the person who engages in suicidal behavior or dies by suicide is trying to relieve a burden from their family and friends. It doesn't feel that way to survivors of suicide loss, but depression lies like nothing else. And depression is a key piece in most suicides.
Definitely. I want to move to our next
Sure.
question, because I think we're in that, we can bounce back before what do we need and theological perspectives, but this is a big question. We're not gonna be able to do all the exhaustive lists, but we want to name that the Christian church we have not done well with suicide. In fact, we have been part of the problem.
Yes, we have.
How we name it. And so today we want to talk a little bit about some theology that has been healthy and emphasize healthy, and then kind of just flow. So those that you've used as a pastor, those that you believe personally.
What I often tell clinicians and pastors is that whatever your personal theology is around suicide, I don't care. Because the moment of crisis is not the time for you to engage in orthodox practice. Time of crisis is for you to come up with something that is authentic, that will save a person's life. When I worked at the state hospital, every day somebody would say to me something like, is suicide a sin? Will I go to hell if I die by suicide? How does God feel about suicide? Some version of those things. And I knew that if I responded in the way that folks in the United Church of Christ typically respond, by saying, God loves you no matter what, God forgives everything, all of the things that we tend to say as progressive Christians, I knew that I'd be putting that person's life at risk, because their belief that suicide was a sin or that they would go to hell was their last protective factor. It was the last thing between them and engaging in suicidal behavior. So I would be irresponsible as a clinician or as a human being to take that away. So I had to come up with something else, because it's really uncomfortable for me to say, yes, you will go to hell. I don't want to say that either, because that puts a different group of people at risk. For those who believe that and have survived suicide loss, if they believe that their loved one is in hell forever, they have a higher risk for suicide themselves so that they can be with their loved one in hell. They won't be alone. So both sides of the theological divide can increase risk in various people, because there's also people who struggle so profoundly with mental health that they believe they're already in hell. And if you say to them that, that they'll go to hell if they die by suicide, they're like, what's the difference? I'm already in hell. So that archaic way of looking at suicide as a sin is not helpful. It's also not biblically based. There's 7 suicides in the Bible, and not one of them mentions God's response. Not one. So the response that we have constructed, the theology around suicide that we have constructed, is entirely constructed by human beings. At a time when the church mostly operated out of fear-based theology. And I think it's outdated and no longer helpful. So now you're all wondering, well, what can I say? If I can't say, yes, you will go to hell, and I can't say nothing can separate you from the love of God, what do I say? The answer that I have come up with for myself, and you're welcome to use it if you wish, is that God is not a fan of suicide. Because I can say that with integrity and with honesty. I don't know what happens after a person dies. I know what I'd like to believe, but truthfully, I don't know. So when I say that God is not a fan of suicide, that means that God would rather we find almost any other way of dealing with the pain that we're in that doesn't reject the gift of life that God has given us. So God would rather we find healthier ways to deal with the pain we're in. So if I'm in conversation with someone, I can say, God is not a fan of suicide. And they almost always say, well, how do you know that? Because if you're suicidal, you're looking for permission. You're looking for validation that says you can die by suicide and there won't be eternal consequences. I was like, well, God gave us this gift of life, and God said it was good. And if you die by suicide, it's like taking that gift and saying, here, I don't want it anymore, take it back. That's really not a position I want to be in with our Creator. And usually the person I'm talking with agrees. And so then we can go on to talk about ways they can deal with the pain they're in, because suicide is about pain. It's about pain first and foremost. We know this from people who've been interviewed after engaging in suicidal behavior. And they say almost to a one, as soon as I did it, I knew I didn't want to die. I just wanted the pain to end. So it's really about finding healthier ways to lessen the psychological and spiritual pain that a person's in.
So grateful. This is where it's at, right? This is, I think, the where our church and where we are as clergy trying to figure out how do we do this.
Right.
I found myself, just to add to this, as a chaplain, and some in our churches, that not every thinking about God in this moment is the last thing we want to do, right? If we're suicidal, or we might have an anger, or God is not our motivating factor. So in addition to what you said, I wanted to add on there that one thing that I've done, whether it's worked all the time or not, is to point out, like you said, the gift of life, the really lifting up the purpose of that person's life and encouraging what I personally have seen in that person.
Right.
Close family member, suicidal, and he called me late at night, and for me it was a natural inclination just to say, here's all the reasons why your life is a gift right now.
Right.
Though they can't see it. If you don't know them personally, that could be harder. But even walking with somebody around, just the value of their life, even when we don't see it, right? Is being a part of a motivating factor. I've had a good friend of mine who, what saved him, he would say, is thinking about all the things that he could do with his children over time. So like literally thinking, oh, I can go bungee jumping with my son, I can go this. And it was literally just like that one little purpose of there's more life to live. And
Right.
so one thing that I've said is that like the idea of there's a bunch of different lives that we can exist in. And I would much rather you throw all your money away and throw all your friends away and pick up and go to a whole nother area, change your name, and just really try to start another life than to actually end your own. And this comes from a personal, but lifting up the purpose or the positivity of what can be in that person's life.
Right. And that's spoken well as a therapist.
That's a therapist's response, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But to balance out, because a lot of times the other piece of theology is that someone who is suicidal will often say that there is no God, or God doesn't care, or God is not in my life. And then I like to go to Psalm 139, which tells us that, there is no place we can go where God is not. So even in the depths of that depression, that despair, that hopelessness, God is present. And, God is that light that shines in the darkness that no darkness can overcome. So then we can engage in a conversation of where do you see glimpses of life, glimpses of hope? Is it your children? Is it someplace you want to go on vacation? Is it something in the world you haven't seen yet? It could be anything that brings in a sense of beauty, a wonder that there is more than just our own personal pain in the world.
I think about the campaign, It Gets Better, and I almost feel like that's the undergirding feel of that.
Yeah. Well, and all emotions pass. Even depression lessens on its own. It could get horrible. I'm a big fan of medical intervention for depression. Antidepressants are very helpful, but all emotions rise and fall. So when you think about the most intense feeling of despair, hopelessness, emptiness, doneness, that doesn't last for all that long if you don't feed it. So what can you do that affirms the exact opposite of what you're feeling right now?
And I appreciate they lifted up, because I'm thinking about all of us maybe in the congregation, or those of us who are outside, understanding again that question of what the family might need or what the friend might need.
Right.
Sometimes I've heard like a moment to make reason or to make meaning of the death. And so what you just named, help, I guess, can help understand at times. One way of understanding, and I'm curious what you think, Dr. Keefe, is that people, like you mentioned, that suicide is not an individual sin. On a psychological level, our emotions and our psyche they don't come from one source. We know that who we are is developed over time by what we smell, what we see on TV, the resources we have access to, the theology we've heard. So if I'm in a state where I have so much pain, where I feel like taking my life is the best option, that is not my fault, and that is not your fault. There's no one person at fault. So that you can know.
Right. There isn't one person at fault. In fact, I do say that suicide is a sin, but not the kind that you think. If anything, the sin lies with the faith community for failing to communicate the love of God in a way that saves the person's life. The good news for sin is that there's grace, there's forgiveness, there's opportunity to begin again, to learn from what we have not yet been able to do, and to grow beyond what we've done in circumstances past, that perhaps the next time we can be more demonstrative, more clear about a person's value, a person's need to be in community, all of those things. So I do think it is a sin, but it's not the individual, it's the community. And we bear that responsibility together, because together we can heal that.
I'm always blown away when you say that. I think it's something that it puts the onus on us in a really healthy way. Community is what we say we do. That's our one job as a church. And I think about the type of community and this idea of being supportive in a non-judgmental way, not just with suicide, but if I come to church and I don't want to be there and I don't want you to touch me and I'm having a day, just being like, hey, I get it. That this environment can be fully accepting of all that we experience in life.
Yep. And that's the challenge for church, is to make room for all. I have an as with one, so with all theology when it comes to the church. So maybe it's ecclesiology more than theology, but whatever. Meaning that if one person among us is suicidal, then the body of Christ is suicidal. And we have responsibility to care for that, because the mandate is to care for the most vulnerable among us. And so if we recognize that one person among us is suicidal, then we have responsibility to raise them up, so that the body of Christ is healthier. We can't say that they're not one of us, or that's not our responsibility. If they walk into the doors of our church, if they live next door to a church member, if they're a community member that has had experience in the church, they're ours. We have to broaden our understanding of who belongs to the body of Christ, because it isn't just the ones who come on Sunday morning. It's all the ones that our lives come into contact with, and all the ones who desperately need to hear that word of hope. It's, we all belong to God in one way or another. And since this is a Christian sponsored event, we'll talk about it from a Christian perspective. We are all called to be part of the body of Christ, all called to be part of the people of God. And part of that is each of us sharing the truth we know about God's love. And if we're not sure of the truth ourselves, then we need to work on that.
That it's spewing out in such a way that there might be someone who doesn't believe like you or doesn't come to your church, that you're still like, I will bring you diapers. What do you need? Like, I'm there.
Exactly.
That Christ would be there.
Exactly.
I know we're getting close to questions. I want us to come back to this, because hopefully we have some questions that keep evoking, what do we believe? But just on a quick practical level, are there a few healthy practices that clergy can do? And maybe we've already named that.
Yeah. I mean, the essential thing is clergy don't shy away from it. As much as possible, if you can get permission from the family to talk about the death in terms of death by suicide, no other details are needed, because that reduces the shame, reduces the stigma, and makes it more likely that the next person who feels suicidal in the community will come forward and ask for help before it gets to the point where they die by suicide. That's one thing. There's all kinds of practices around a memorial services that can be helpful. Again, you use safe messaging, and you don't assure people that the person who died by suicide is at peace with God, because that makes suicide look really good to anybody who's vulnerable. You also, on the same, don't say that they're in hell, because you've increased the vulnerability, the risk for others. So find a message of hope, that focuses on the people who are gathered. This pain is overwhelming, it's unbearable, but as long as we have breath, there is hope that God's Spirit will move in and among us and create healing bonds that will help us to bear this burden together. There's ways to talk about it in that way. And if you eulogize a person, their death was a small part of their life. So to not make it all about how they died, but to talk about the fullness of who that person was. It's essential. And to recognize that though this person died a tragic death, that doesn't diminish the ways in which they touched our lives. It's tricky, because we want to give hope. We want to open the possibility of healing, but also recognize the tremendous amount of pain and vulnerability in the room.
I appreciate you naming that, because this idea, like you said, mourning or grief is hard for us. Even pastors, we still don't do, how do we mourn? Because culturally we don't.
Right.
And so this idea of holding the tension of hope and grief in the same moment, right?
Yep.
Is difficult.
It is.
When I think about, and this is, one of the things that I think about in that setting is this idea of support with like physical, tangible presence. That this is more therapeutic, but when right after, to be alone is a really hard. Not that I need you to talk to me, not that I need you to help fix my feelings,
Just
but
show up.
Being there. Yeah.
Yep.
And so churches can do ice cream socials, they can do events, they can do things to just be present.
Yep. And if someone's struggling with a suicide loss and they're not able to engage, but they're in the room, don't put any pressure on them. Just be grateful that they are in the room, because they want to be surrounded by people and signs of life and hope, but are not yet ready to engage. And so to be aware that we don't want to put pressure on anybody to engage in anything.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, friends. Thank you, Rachel and Angela, for this important conversation. And the conversation doesn't end here, but we did receive a question that I want to share out with you all and get your responses. It's a practical question. How do you handle the prayer of commendation without proclaiming that the deceased is at rest with God? This participant is having trouble imagining that part of the service without maintaining that neutral theology, while maintaining that neutral theology.
That's a tricky one, but I usually, commend to God the care of this person. That's what we do with the prayer of commendation, is that we are placing this person in God's care, because they're no longer physically present with us. So I usually end the prayer at that. We commend with love the care of this person's spirit to God, and we pray that God will continue to be present with us as we grieve and remember and re-enter into our daily living. So there's a way to do it, because you can still commend their soul to God, as the traditional prayer goes, but stop there. You don't have to proclaim peace, because you don't know. I mean, I want to believe that the person is at peace, but I don't know for sure. And I don't want to increase the risk by saying something that I say at funerals. In fact, I've just stopped saying that they are at rest with God in all the funerals I do. I just took it out. We commend to God with care and thanksgiving the life of this person, and don't put in the line about trusting God's eternal peace or things like that, just because I don't want to give a message that I know something for certain that I don't know. And that's how I've done it, authentically believing what I believe. And I encourage you to find a way to do it that matches your belief system and is authentic for you.
Good. I appreciate that. As clergy, it's hard for us to exist in the unknown in general. And so the bravery around finding what we do know and lifting that up and still holding what we don't know.
Right.
No matter who.
And I realize that in the United Church of Christ and the disciples, we have freedom to rewrite liturgy, that other denominations are a little more reluctant to rewrite what's in a book of worship or in liturgy. So you have to navigate that within the limits of your own denomination as well.
I just wanted to come back to, until we might have a couple more questions before we close, but the idea of what clergy can do as well is creating a space for conversation. So maybe we may not be trained, but we can pull in people we know. Just like we might have a guest preacher, we might have a guest therapist do a group with people around, making sure that we are really encouraging people to go to counseling, to go to a professional, or to at least communicate their own of suicide. That is huge coming from a clergy person.
Right. The communicate the feelings, but also if you feel like someone might be suicidal, ask them. Don't be afraid to ask. We don't have that kind of power over someone, that the old thing that, if you talk about suicide, someone will do it. None of us has that kind of power in anybody's life. And one of the greatest things you can do toward prevention is to ask, I'm concerned you might be suicidal because I've observed whatever change in behavior or attitude or whatever. Are you? And give the person permission to say yes. Make space for that conversation. And then there's follow-up that you can do. But, if you're afraid someone might be suicidal, the best thing you can do is ask them.
Yep. I have one more question before we wrap up that came in. This participant says, I'm a member of a church in a relatively small town where there have been 3 suicides of young people since January. The young people in question did not know each other. None were members of the church. Do you have any experience working on suicide prevention or other mental health issues with constituencies outside of your church? For instance, boards of education, town councils, etc. Thank you.
I do. I have worked with school systems. I have worked with town councils and addressing what it is that's happening in the small town and what increases suicidality among youth. We know that one of the factors for youth is a pervasive sense of hopelessness, and youth by nature sort of lack an understanding that life won't be what it is in this moment. They don't have the capacity to envision a different life that they have than what they have in the moment. But yes, the answer to that question is yes, it is possible to have conversations with people who are outside of the theological loop, so to speak, that can bring the theology into practice in real ways. Like, I don't have to explicitly talk about theology to do postvention or prevention or even intervention work. So be in touch if I can be helpful. I'm more than willing to have a conversation.
Perfect. Yep, Angela, you have a final comment?
Yeah, if we had time, I just would love to just speak directly to those of us on this call who are suffering the loss of a friend or family to either suicide or suicidal behavior, or those of us who are suicidal. I think at any moment, like you mentioned, this is something that we all can hold, or all may hold. And so I wanted to start for those of you on the call that, like I mentioned before, it is for somebody like myself who've had family or friends call, whoever you are, I find that the potential of who you are in that person's life, so if I'm like a family or friend, is astronomically great. There's so much going on behind the people you love. Maybe we can't communicate it. Sometimes we don't express it, but just to know that what you mean to us, or what you mean to those of us who are in your circle, in your community. Close friends of mine who have opened up and said, hey, I'm struggling with it. It would stop me in my tracks. I didn't even know. And the ability to be let into that was priceless. And so I encourage you, if you have not told the people closest to you or told anybody that this is what you're walking with, please try, please do that. There is somebody out there that wants to know, wants to walk with you. And like my sister said earlier, that there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God, in the sense that in my own life, whatever emotion I have, whatever energy or thought I have, whether it's to God, to creation, to other people, nothing makes us too bad or our life too wrong to keep living. That grace is abound for all of us, and none of us get it right. We all need grace and use grace. And so I encourage you, if you are feeling so sinful, or you've done something so wrong, or somehow just feel not worth, to know that that you are worth it, even though if we can't see it. And I know this is a random lady you don't know, but it's something that has held people closest to me in that moment. And so, Rachel, if you had anything else.
I second everything you just said. And I want to just affirm that there is help out there. And the pain might not completely ever go away, but it can get to a point where it doesn't consume you. And if you can have the courage to just get the words out, to say that you're struggling with thoughts of suicide, or that you are overwhelmed with the grief of a suicide loss, to someone that you trust who will hear you and accept the pain that you're in without trying to fix it, but also know that there are resources out there. We have some up on the screen for immediate crisis, but there is always someone who will listen. There is always someone who sees you and knows you and loves you for who you are, flaws and faults and sins and all. And what I usually end when I'm doing this live in person with a ritual where I hand out red marbles. And because they symbolize love, everybody sees red and white and they think Valentine's Day. So I hand them out and I say to each person by name, you are God's beloved and you are loved beyond your wildest imagination. And then I encourage people to hold on to that marble as long as they need that message or until they meet someone who needs it more than they do. So if you meet someone who is in the suicidal amount of pain, telling them that they are loved, that they are valued, that there is a community waiting for them somewhere, can go further than you might guess.
I want to thank both you, Angela and Rachel, for leading us in this conversation and sharing wisdom today. We did get one more question, which we won't be able to get to, but I want to put it out there, and perhaps this, Angela, we can have conversation about, is this another topic that we need to bring to bear in this conversation at a later date? Basically, the question is the idea that a lot of suicide stems from oppressive social systems. How do we as clergy address both the individual and the systems that perpetuate suicidality? I think that's an important conversation about what's happening in our greater context that is pressing in on this reality that we're living in. And so I want to thank first the participant for sharing that question, and we will look forward to how we might respond to that as well. And I want to thank all of you, our participants, for being with us today, for taking time out of your day to have this conversation or be a part of this dialogue. And we want to encourage you to continue to be a part of this dialogue. Consider the many ways that you and your ministry context might be further involved, in being welcoming communities for those who have experienced or are currently experiencing some sort of mental health challenge, for reaching out and finding resources to address suicidality and so many other issues that we all live or are present with in our communities. Today's webinar, as we reminded you, is being recorded, and we will share out in the coming weeks. To continue to be connected to MBA's Mental Health and Wellness Initiative, we invite you to email Angela at whitenhill@mbacares.org or to visit our website at www.mbacares.org/mental-health. And we invite you to remember to like MBA on Facebook or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Visit our MBA webpage for more information related to the Disciples Health and Social Service Ministries, and look out for our upcoming events. Thank you so much, and we hope that you have a great afternoon.